Welcome back to another slum-surviving and pile-driving episode of What Happened, the show that I use as an excuse to talk way too much about Capcom. Speaking of which, Capcom! While their last few years have been riddled with blockbuster successes, the late 90s and early 2000s were a bit more hit and miss. For every Resident Evil 2, there was a Resident Evil Survivor. For every Mega Man, there was a Fox Hunt. And for every great fighting game, there was a not-so-great fighting game. With that said, though, this is going to go beyond just breaking down the development of an infamous entry in a long-running beat-em-up franchise, but rather one that also helped establish an entire studio, and in a roundabout and rather ironic way, was also partially responsible for its demise. So, strap on your chest belts and sharpen your knives as I answer the question, what happened to Final Fight Revenge?
Final Fight Revenge!
In 1995, Capcom was swinging into high with notable releases like Night Warriors, Marvel's Superheroes, Mega Man X3, and of course, manufacturing the arcade version of Toshinden 2. I will never get used to saying that. It was also an important year for another reason, in that they opened a new Sunnydale, California-based branch named Capcom Digital Studios. Now, to get some additional insight into this narrow band of time for Capcom, I reached out to Jim Wallace, who worked there for several years and played a prominent role on Final Fight Revenge. Most sources have very little information on Capcom Digital Studios or CDS's early days, but Jim was able to provide some intriguing backstory for how and why they were formed. I was hired to lead audio for the new team and started in early 1995. Initially, we were greenlit for 3 games, a platformer, a role-playing game, and a 3D football game. Richard Moore, our studio director, attracted very talented folks, and then those people brought in others, which eventually led us having a very solid development team. After about a year or so of us being in production on the 3 games, Capcom's Japanese management abruptly canceled all 3 titles. This disrupted the studio greatly, and it wasn't long before most of the team quit and moved on to other companies. Now, as for my role on the team, while we were in production on the initial 3 games, I was asked to be an interim producer for someone who had taken leave. While it was clear that this person had made the decision to not come back, I was promoted to producer while also maintaining my audio responsibilities. Following the mass exodus, there were not many of us that chose to stay with the company. I felt it was an opportunity to develop as a producer, so I stayed on. For those curious cats out there, those 3 canceled games were Major Damage, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and Iron Man Football. Jim stated that this went on until Capcom's main Osaka headquarters suddenly asked them to take point on making a 3D fighting game, something very few, i.e. none of the staff had any experience doing. While obviously interested in, developing video games, the team thought honesty would be the best policy and advised the higher-ups that they might not be the best choice for the project. Capcom then compromised by sending 2 of their senior Japanese staff to live and work in Sunnydale, which would hopefully steer the project away from being featured on What Happened some 25 years later, which obviously didn't work. One of the Japanese developers in question was Tetsuya Iijima, who previously produced both X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Darkstalkers 3, and worked as a planner on the game that Capcom likes to pretend never existed and refuses to re-release in non-ugly, expensive, European-only arcade stick form, Alien vs. Predator. Iijima obviously had a respected fighting game acumen, but the project would also be monitored in Japan by Yoshiki Okamoto, who I don't think needs any introduction, but here you go. The press actually first caught wind of this collab pretty early on in late 1997, specifically in a rumor mill article in Electronic Gaming Monthly, which plainly stated that both Iijima and Capcom USA were cooking up Final Fight EX. It's not 100% clear if that moniker was chosen by EGM, but Jim did recall that being a potential name for a time. But regardless, the article was bereft of any gameplay details. It doesn't even state that it's a fighter, but it did make clear what technology it would be running on. This then leads us to one of the most critical parts of this whole story. While Capcom's 2D fighters are made famous for running on their powerful CPS boards, and Star Gladiator and Rival Schools were built on ones derived from the PlayStation, Final Fight Revenge truly blazed its own path in this regard, which was both an admirable but inadvisable thing. Capcom had a wide variety of arcade boards they could have chosen to power this new game, but according to Jim Wallace, there was a specific reason that they went with the one they did. We later learned that Capcom had an agreement to fulfill with Sega, and as this was near the end of the Saturn life cycle, it seemed that there was little appetite to have the game developed in Japan. From my recollection, since the Saturn and the Titan SVT arcade hardware were essentially the same, minus the ability to stream music on Titan, our lead programmer made the decision to develop primarily on the Titan and then port to the Saturn. Ah yes, the Titan video board, which by every possible metric was aging out considerably since it had been in use since '94. While quite a few gorgeous 2D games like Golden Axe the Duel and Astra Superstars ran on it, was also capable of handling the 3 dimensions of Die Hard Arcade, Winter Heat, and Sega Bass Fishing. So this is the one and only Capcom game that ran on the SVT and totally jives with Jim's statement earlier that this represented a deal struck between both Sega and Capcom. Capcom had supported the Saturn during its entire life cycle with an impressive lineup of amazing arcade ports, so many in fact that you could make the argument they were one of the best represented third parties on the machine. At the same time, Capcom were also putting out games exclusively on the PlayStation, like Star Gladiator and Rival Schools, and since those were 3D, which was where the winds were blowing at that time, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see both companies coming to an agreement to deliver a flashy 3D effort on the Saturn, which always struggled to be seen on the same technological level as Sony's competing product. Sega would therefore provide the board and Capcom would provide the game, but since their coin-op division were already quite busy, and as Jim stated, probably had little desire to work on an underpowered board, Capcom senior management in Japan went looking for someone who would. And guess who was totally available? So yeah, that's partially why Final Fight Revenge looks like it does. Blocky, stumpy character models with a lot of visible polygons and flickering, low detail compressed images that made up the entirety of the stages, an animation that fails to impress when compared to most, if not all, of Capcom's fighting classics. Jim shared with me, however, that the staff were fully aware they wouldn't be able to compete with those same classics, so they decided to find other directions to lean into. The team was shooting for fun and a bit tongue-in-cheek. Given the very tight timeline for development and the lack of experience of the team, the designers knew they could not rival a top Capcom fighting game, so they went for something a bit outrageous. I mean, Eddie E's super move was a police car ramming into his opponent. While I mentioned that the team was inexperienced, they were very ambitious and quite talented. 3 of the 3D artists on the team were learning 3D as we were developing the game, and all went on to continue as 3D artists in the gaming industry. I assume that zaniness also resulted in stuff like final boss Belger being resurrected as a zombie and treating everyone to the Thriller dance. Even with the talent that Jim mentioned though, the team struggled working with arcade technology that was already behind the times, often having their art, animation, and even audio pipelines bottlenecked by many limitations. Although, thanks to some clever programming, they were eventually able to find some workarounds. A question I had though was why Final Fight to begin with? Why develop an arcade fighting game spin-off to a franchise that hadn't been in an arcade since 1989? And related to that, Final Fight was already 3 games deep by this time, 4 if you count the mighty NES version, but it was decided that this spin-off would ignore almost all of them, instead taking place immediately after the events of the first game. So fans of Carlos, Maki, or Dean, yes, there's dozens of us, were always going to be disappointed with the roster because it exclusively revolved around the 3 original heroes who saved Metro City. Now, this next bit is speculative on my part, but companies like Capcom, Sega, and Namco typically liked celebrating franchise milestones with new products, and 1999 just so happened to be the 10-year anniversary of Final Fight. It's therefore possible that this project is the way it is because of that. A celebration of the franchise that brings back the original main cast with various winks and nods and discards some of the things that came after. You can chalk this one up as a bit of an educated guess, but it's the only thing that really makes sense to me. With that in mind, allow me to introduce you to this piece of concept art that has long been associated with the project and illustrated by legendary Capcom artist Akiman, which Jim confirmed to me is the real deal. I think this is a legit piece of style guide artwork that we were sent from Japan. Our art team had sent over some of our initial character models to Japan for approval, and I remember receiving the feedback that they wanted changes to proportions. They then sent us some great reference artwork. I think this is from that. As for which characters made it into the final game, I cannot remember how that decision was made. Obviously, some of you might be wondering why Chun-Li and Guile are included here out of all the possible choices from Street Fighter, but there's actually a good reason for that. They both had their own respective cameos in Final Fight 2. But the only thing weirder than everything else we've covered so far is Final Fight Revenge's distribution, or lack thereof, which just so happens to be one of the most confounding things to this whole oddball tale. I tried really hard, and I'm 99% sure that outside of special imports, the arcade cab of Final Fight Revenge never made its way over to the West, at least officially. There are absolutely no English arcade flyers ever made, and all databases I combed through were either not specific about where it was available or just listed Japan. The reason I was so adamant to confirm this, though, was why? Why was a US-made fighting game based on a series that had sold millions of cartridges worldwide and was 1989's biggest arcade smash across the globe not available across the globe? Well, there's 2 schools of thought on this, and both could be right or wrong. The first reason was that Revenge was never meant to leave Japan in the first place. If Capcom and Sega had struck a deal for a Saturn exclusive, it would actually make sense that they wouldn't have bothered localizing it. Remember, the Saturn was quite successful in its home country, unlike the West, and saw game releases well after the Dreamcast's debut. And with that, the vast majority of its gaming catalog was never even localized to begin with. And for even further proof of Capcom's intentions here, they never bothered to bring the impressive port of Street Fighter Alpha 3 over to Western Saturn fans either. The second reason could be that senior Capcom execs just looked at the finished game and simply didn't feel it was worth distributing in Western arcades or even consoles. Personally, I think the former is the slightly more logical of the two. Capcom were not against releasing the occasional stinker from time to time, so the fact that they would suddenly cluck their tongues and stroke their beards at this seems less likely to me. Jim feels it's somewhere in the middle, saying that, with all of the great titles Capcom was creating at the time, I don't think they felt FFR was deserving of marketing dollars or wide distribution. It was a quirky, fun game, just try to play it and not laugh, and was also a team development exercise. So, after a disastrous run in Japanese game centers, in March of 2000, Final Fight Revenge Violent Storm Rising busted onto the Saturn, and unfortunately, didn't do much better there. For the few magazines that reviewed it, it did not score well. A 20 out of 40 in Famitsu and a 40 out of 100 in GameFan Magazine, with the reviewer ECM stating, "Capcom's Final Fight Revenge is a game that brings new meaning to whether or not it's better to let a console go quietly into the long dark night or go kicking and screaming in utter agony. The initial version of Virtua Fighter that graced the Saturn at launch is a better looking and infinitely better playing game than FFR. If that doesn't get the point across, then nothing will." Wow. Anyway, let's just focus on that bit about the Saturn. Despite the less than stellar reviews, Final Fight Revenge does hold the distinction of being one of, if not the last commercially released game for the console, outside of some unlicensed lewd titles, and due to its low print run, is one of the rarer games as well. This is what caused Revenge's physical price to skyrocket over the last 2 decades, coupled with the fact that Capcom has never seen fit to re-release it in any form whatsoever, so it's way more expensive than it is actually worth playing.
You'd either have to be a Final Fight mega fan to pay money for this, or be somebody who's addicted to buying shit and have no concept in the value of money. You have to be a total loser. Thanks, Matt McMuscles, for sending me your copy.
Yeah, what a loser. Now that I think about it though, damn, every fighting game that Capcom has ever released in the 90s was successful enough to warrant some type of update or sequel. Street Fighter 2, obviously, the Marvel games, JoJo, Darkstalkers, Power Stone, hell, even Cyberbots at least got a spiritual successor in Techromancer. So that's Revenge's other distinction, I guess. It was the only fighting game that Capcom saw absolutely no future in.
Busted!
As for Jim Wallace, well, shortly after the release of FFR, Jim left to produce games under Sony for several years, touching many major franchises like God of War, Uncharted, and Gran Turismo, and now currently works at Google. What happened to CDS? Well, in the early 2000s, Capcom renamed them to Capcom Studio 8, who then developed both Maximo games, which were released to considerable critical acclaim and fan admiration. However, it was the low sales and extremely negative reception to the much maligned Final Fight Streetwise that I've covered already, because of course I did, which sadly was the impetus for Capcom to close the studio permanently. This was really a bummer because a senior exec who shall remain nameless, it was this guy, decided prior to the release of Streetwise to cancel Production Studio 8's 2 other in-development titles, Maximo 3 and a brand new action IP called De Vargas that friend of the show, Trent Kanuga, shared a look at on his social media back in 2020. It's certainly possible that another Maximo sequel or a fresh new game could have performed better at retail than a gritty, generic reimagining of a beloved IP, but sadly, we'll never know. As for Final Fight itself, well, despite us being in a literal beat-em-up renaissance, Capcom seems content with doing anything but developing a new game, like referencing it constantly in the recent Street Fighter 6, including the first acknowledgement of Revenge in 24 years, so at least that's something, I think. Thanks again to Jim Wallace for taking his time to answer my questions. And if you out there know of any other brawling blunders in the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or enter the dank, punk-infested streets of my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!